You'll often hear people say that like living in community is activism, like just in and of itself, like choosing to live your life in a different way um, is often a form of activism. I don't think that that's always 100% true, but for a lot of people, especially if you're living a lifestyle based on your values, that is a certain form of activism. It's not necessarily the same kind of activism as going out and trying to really actively change the world, change our culture, change other people's minds or perceptions. But the two blend together pretty well. I mean, like Dancing Rabbit is both that first kind of activism of like we're choosing to live by our values, and that is a statement just in and of itself. And then on top of that, to different degrees, different each person, we try then to promote what we're doing and influence the world by being on TV, giving tours, going and giving talks at classes, of college students or elementary schools or whatever. We are actively trying to change our culture, actively trying to influence what people are doing, to promote ecological living, to promote sustainability, to promote community. And so we are also activists at that level. There's also activism at the level of like resisting bad things that are happening in the world. And I think from the beginning we sort of chose to be a positive example rather than to be working against things. And I think that the world really needs both. Like I think that I really value that there are activists that when like someone's trying to take away our rights or to do something bad, that they're there stopping it. Like I want that and I support that, and there's times where I'm there with them. And then I also think that if that was all we ever did, that wouldn't be enough, because we need positive examples of, well, what is the culture that we're trying to create? Not just stopping them taking away the rights, but actually, going beyond and saying, well, what do we want the world to be? And so I feel like that's the kind of activism that we're doing, is being that positive example activism, and that's going to touch people in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's just a sort of inspiring, like, we're glad you're doing what you're doing. It's so great. They might not change their specific life, but they're just like, they take a certain inspiration that like people are choosing to live by their values and choosing to do something about a problem. That there's a problem in the world, and we are taking it upon ourselves to change our behavior as it relates to that and make the world a better place. And like that's a powerful statement, and hopefully an inspiring statement. Hopefully something that will encourage other people to do the same. Not exactly the same, activity, but to change their lives to make the world a better place. And that's really all that I hope, that we can do here, is just like make the world a better place in that way, be a part of the solution. I think when I was younger, I used to think like, we're going to save the world, and now I don't think I mean anything different, but I think I say it now as, we're going to affect some change, or we're going to like play our part in, the global shift or a cultural change. We're going to be one agent of that change. We try to change people not by pushing them to change, but by inspiring them to change. And to me, one of the ways that you inspire people to change is you have to meet them where they are. And so that's going to be different for the people who are, for most of the people that live in our rural farming community. That's going to be different for them than for someone who lives in an urban area, or someone who's already interested in sustainable living and wants to take a step further, or to me it's not about we have to I feel like we need to be sensitive and careful around our neighbors, both because it could have more of a negative effect. Like if I offend someone who lives in Chicago, whatever. If I offend someone who lives in Rutledge, then that could actually be bad for us. And so I do feel like there's some care that's taken there for our own benefit. But it's also a matter of what I think is going to actually affect change in our local community is different than what I think is going to affect change for people from further away. And so when I have a group of people who's from the local area and I'm giving them a tour, I give them a different tour than when I get someone from St. Louis. In the same way that I give a different tour to college students as I do to 6th graders. And so, which I'm not trying to imply anything by that, but But it's more about, like, I will talk to our local farmers, and they will say, many of them will say, like, yeah, I realize that what we're doing is not sustainable. I'm not sure that I see the economic, but they also need to, they're interested in change, but they're not ready to, like, jump to doing permaculture, but they're interested in, no-till. They're interested in how solar power could work for them, how wind power could work for them. They're interested in, how smaller scale value-added crops could be appropriate for this area. I mean, there are interest in those things that can be more sustainable, but I don't try and reach out to them with some of the same dynamics. So I don't feel like there's some dichotomy between how we relate to our neighbors and how we relate to the rest of the world. I think it's in both cases it's about meeting people where they are, connecting with them, inspiring them, but not going and saying, what you're doing is wrong, you have to change. Because that rarely works. I mean, occasionally someone will be shocked by it, but for the most part, people are just going to dig in their heels. Whereas if you just say, like, we're doing this thing, we think it's really good, is there any way that we can help you? Is there any way that you're interested in what we're doing? We're happy to help you if you're interested. And so that, I think that's the take, the direction that we take with both groups, really. And I don't think there has to be a separation between sort of activists who are defending our rights or keeping bad things from happening versus those who are making positive change. I don't think they have to be separate. I think that it's interesting, like, because I actually think like activism in an urban area is so different than activism in a rural area. It's really tricky, and like I've almost lost touch a little bit. It took me so long to really understand what activism meant out here, and that I've lost a little bit of touch with what activism means in an urban area. But I think a community living in an urban area can be both demonstrating that positive change and, fighting City Hall or going to protests or whatever. I don't see any reason why both of those can't work hand in hand. I do think, it's potential that you could become a target for retribution in some ways, and obviously a community would have to be careful of that. But there's no reason that you can't be sort of politically active in that way. I mean, I still think that people have to sort of be the change they want to see, like, the question of like violent activism or like sort of, like the kind of activism that's, doing property damage or whatever. I'm not going to say that is never appropriate, but you really have to be careful about, when you're doing that, how, like, what effect it's really going to have. Is it going to really achieve your desired goals? Is it fair? Is it morally just? Are you really justified in doing that? And it's interesting, like, as far as rural activism, I guess if we wanted to, we could be going and like freeing the animals from the CAFO, from the confined animal feeding operation 2 miles north of us and letting the pigs run free, but I actually don't think that's going to achieve the change that we want, even though it's morally reprehensible to me that animals are being treated that way. I just don't think that's really going to achieve that goal. And so what I've learned is that rural activism is often, in some ways, a lot more akin to community active, like to being sort of an activist within your community, and it's about working within the process. Because there's not, in this rural area, it's not like there's some monolithic city hall that you have no ability to influence. It's like when I want to talk to the county commissioners, I call them up on the phone and I go and talk to them. Like, I do have access to the power. And a lot of times all it really takes is someone who's just like wants to make that change, and you can do it. If you'll actually get the support of the people around you, you can make it happen. And so rural activism, small town activism there's a difference to it, and it's a lot more about connecting. And I think it's because there's less anonymity, there's less alienation, there's more access to the power structures because they're not so big. Until you start getting into things like how does Cargill and Monsanto affect our rural community, that's where it sort of like bridges that gap between our small town activism, but then we've got this big corporation that in some ways has control over the dynamics in our community, and it's this outside force. Though it's an outside force that some people are positive on and connected to, and so you have to be careful about trashing Monsanto when there are people who work as representatives of Monsanto, who buy their seed, who are supportive of genetically modified stuff and Roundup Ready beans. I mean, that's what our neighbors plant, and yet many of them, they'll say, they don't like the control that Monsanto has over the seed supply, the control, the effects that genetic engineering might have, but they want to do it in a way that doesn't affect their livelihood, because they're cautious about that as well, and that's a reasonable, need and that they need met.